The day a man finally chooses himself is the day the entire world around him starts acting strange. Not because he changed the world, but because he stopped begging it to accept him. I want you to imagine something for a moment. Imagine waking up tomorrow and realizing that every ounce of energy you've spent trying to prove your worth was never required in the first place. For most of your life, you were taught a quiet lie. Be the nice guy, be understanding, be patient, sacrifice more, love harder, and maybe, just maybe, someone will finally see your value. But here's what years of studying relationships as a psychologist has taught me about men. The moment a man starts negotiating his worth, he slowly erases himself. He stops saying what he actually thinks. He starts tolerating what he actually hates. He begins shaping his life around someone else's comfort. Not because he's weak, because he's loyal. And loyalty, when given to the wrong people, becomes self-destruction. I've seen this pattern in men from New York to London, from Toronto to small towns nobody talks about. The same story repeats. A man gives everything, his time, his emotional energy, his patience, and somewhere deep down he believes, if I just prove I'm good enough, she'll stay. But something strange happens over time. The more he sacrifices himself, the less respect he receives. The more he tries to hold everything together, the more invisible he becomes, until one quiet day, something inside him breaks. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a silent realization. He sits there, staring at the life he built for everyone else, and asks himself a question that changes everything. When was the last time I chose myself? Most men can't answer that question because they were never taught that choosing themselves was even allowed. But the moment a man begins asking that question, a psychological shift begins. His brain starts noticing things it ignored for years. The disrespect he laughed off, the emotional games he excused, the exhaustion he normalized. And suddenly, the fog lifts. The approval he chased stops mattering. The validation he depended on starts losing its power. And for the first time in years, he feels something unfamiliar. Clarity. And clarity is dangerous, because once a man truly sees the reality of his life, he can never unsee it. The version of him that tolerated everything begins to die, and something much stronger starts waking up. But here's the part nobody warns men about. The moment you begin choosing yourself, some people will panic, not because you're doing something wrong, but because the version of you they benefited from is disappearing, and the man replacing him is someone they can no longer control. That moment is where your real life begins. When a man finally decides to choose himself, something unexpected happens. He becomes quiet. Not weak quiet, dangerous quiet. The kind of silence that comes from someone who finally understands the game. You see, for years, many men operate from a place of emotional hunger. They chase approval, they chase affection, they chase reassurance, and every time they chase, they unknowingly place themselves in a weaker psychological position. Because the person who needs less always holds more power. This isn't manipulation, it's human nature. And once a man truly understands this, he stops playing the role he was conditioned to perform. He stops explaining himself endlessly. He stops begging for understanding. He stops trying to fix people who never planned to change. Instead, something fascinating begins to happen. His standards rise. The conversations he tolerates change. The behavior he allows around him changes. The energy he gives becomes selective. And the world reacts immediately. Some people accuse him of changing. Some call him cold. Others say he became selfish. But what they're really reacting to is the loss of access. The man who used to overgive is gone. The man who used to tolerate disrespect is gone. The man who used to sacrifice his peace just to keep someone around no longer exists. And psychologically, this is where a man's transformation becomes unstoppable. Because once he experiences the peace that comes from self-respect, he cannot return to emotional chaos. His mind begins rewiring itself. Instead of asking, How do I keep this person in my life? He starts asking a far more powerful question. Does this person deserve access to my life? That single mental shift changes everything. His confidence stops being loud, it becomes calm, grounded, unshakable. He no longer needs to prove his value because he already knows it. And ironically, this is when people begin noticing him more. Not because he is trying harder, because he stopped trying at all. Human psychology is strange that way. People feel when someone is centered within themselves. They sense emotional stability. They sense boundaries. They sense a man who will walk away rather than tolerate disrespect. And that energy is magnetic. But it doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from something much deeper: self-trust. A man who chooses himself develops a quiet belief in his own judgment. He stops asking the world what he should accept. He already knows. And once that internal compass activates, his entire life begins shifting. His relationships become healthier. His decisions become sharper. His emotional energy stops leaking into people who never valued it. But the most powerful change happens internally. For the first time, he respects himself, and that changes the way the entire world responds to him. There's a moment in every man's life that no one talks about. It's the moment he realizes how much of his life was built around fear. Fear of losing someone, fear of being alone, fear of not being enough. And that fear quietly controls his decisions for years. He stays longer than he should. He forgives things that slowly damage his self-respect. He convinces himself that loyalty means enduring everything. But psychology reveals something powerful about human behavior. People rarely respect what they never risk losing. And the man who fears walking away often becomes the one taken for granted. Not because he lacks value, but because he never enforced it. The day a man chooses himself, that fear begins to dissolve. He realizes something most people never fully understand. Loneliness is temporary, but losing yourself can last a lifetime. When that realization hits, something inside him stabilizes. He stops clinging, he stops chasing, he stops over-explaining. Instead, he becomes comfortable with something most people are terrified of: walking away. And this is where his power truly begins. Walking away is not about anger, it's about clarity. It's about recognizing when your presence is no longer respected. It's about protecting the one thing no relationship should ever cost you: your identity. A man who chooses himself understands that love should never require self-abandonment. Respect should never require emotional exhaustion, and connection should never require constant proving. So he starts building a different life, a life centered around growth, around discipline, around purpose. He invests in his health, he sharpens his mind, he focuses on building something meaningful with his time. And as strange as it sounds, this is often when the people who ignored his value begin noticing it. Because humans instinctively respect those who respect themselves. But by this point, something has changed inside him. The validation he once craved no longer controls him. He isn't trying to impress anyone anymore. He's focused on becoming someone he respects. And that shift changes his entire presence. He walks differently. He speaks with intention. He carries a calm confidence that doesn't need approval. And here's the fascinating psychological truth. When a man stops fearing loss, he becomes impossible to control, because manipulation only works on someone who is afraid to walk away. But the man who chose himself already faced that fear, and once he conquered it, his life began moving in a completely different direction. The day a man truly chooses himself, his life doesn't explode with instant success. Something much more powerful happens. His life becomes peaceful, not boring, peaceful. And for many men, that feeling is unfamiliar at first, because chaos used to feel normal: constant emotional tension, trying to decode mixed signals, overthinking conversations, wondering where you stand. But the man who chooses himself stops living in emotional confusion. His boundaries remove the noise. His standards filter the people around him. His time becomes too valuable to waste on uncertainty. And suddenly, his world becomes clear. The right people feel easy to be around. The wrong people naturally disappear. And for the first time in years, his mind becomes quiet. No constant overthinking, no emotional roller coasters, just direction, purpose, growth. This is the version of masculinity most people never talk about. Not aggression, not dominance, self-mastery. A man who chooses himself becomes deeply focused on the life he is building. He invests in his physical strength. He builds financial stability. He develops emotional discipline. And that combination creates something incredibly rare, a grounded man. And grounded men move differently through life. They are not easily manipulated. They are not desperate for validation. They do not chase people who bring chaos. They attract people who respect stability. But the most important change happens internally. He becomes proud of the man he sees in the mirror, not because he is perfect, but because he stopped betraying himself. And once a man stops abandoning his own values, his confidence becomes permanent. It no longer depends on other people's opinions. It comes from living in alignment with who he truly is. And that is the moment his entire life transforms, not when the world finally chooses him, but when he finally chooses himself. So I want to leave you with a question that most men never ask themselves, a brutally honest one. If your life were an equation, it would look like this: self-respect plus boundaries plus purpose, the man you become. But here's the real question. Which part of that equation have you been ignoring the most? Self-respect, boundaries, or purpose? Tell me your answer in the comments. And if this message resonated with you, take a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with a friend who might need to hear it today. Because sometimes, one realization is all it takes for a man's life to change forever.